Okay, the title of the talk, somewhat disingenuous, but was hoping to draw you in, and I appreciate you all coming just on the eve of the Thanksgiving break. I don't know if I love Sherman and Beast Butler, but having lived with both of them intellectually for several years, I do respect them. But I wanted to start actually by polling the audience and asking people what they would say about William Sherman. What images come to mind? What stories come to mind? Destruction, yes.
Before or after we took your civil rights?
Before. Huh? A hell of a general. I guess it depends which side you're on, right? Well, probably there's no greater villain in Southern popular memory of the Civil War than General Sherman. And for those who need a little background, Sherman led an army, about 60,000 hand-picked veterans in a swath that cut through the heart of the Confederacy. Now, certainly there had been fighting on home ground before, but Sherman deliberately targeted the home front as a means of simultaneously destroying military resources and the morale of the Southern people. Sherman set off from Atlanta in November of 1864, but far earlier in the war, another man had gained notoriety as the devil incarnate, and that was Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler, probably not as well known, but he served as the military governor of occupied New Orleans from May until December of 1862. Now, from the outset, in New Orleans, Confederate women took every opportunity they could to insult Federal soldiers. They spat at them, they swung their skirts away, they crossed the sidewalk so they wouldn't have to walk past them. And it increasingly exasperated Butler, who wrote to a friend, "How long do you suppose our flesh and blood could have stood this?" And he came up with his own ingenious answer, which was the infamous General Order Number 28. Well, General Order Number 28 stated that any woman, and he wrote, calling herself a lady, who displayed public contempt for a Union soldier would be, and this is a quote, regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. Now, this order outraged military leaders and politicians in the South, obviously. But in the North, people were quite perturbed about this too, and even across the Atlantic, where the British Prime Minister claimed that the history of civilized nations afforded no example of so infamous an act. Now, this is a great story, and it's certainly been remembered anecdotally, and students find it amusing in class, yes? Okay. And as a colleague alerted me to, and this is still the case because I checked, this order is one of the few facsimiles of historical documents available for purchase at the National Museum of History in Washington, D.C. Amongst the others you can buy are the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address. The other really interesting thing about this is it's filed under women's history. And it is actually known, it came to be known as the Woman Order. Now, I'm going to come back to the Woman Order momentarily, but I want to start with William Sherman. In December of 1862, this is 2 years before his march, it was becoming clear that Butler was going to be recalled from his position as military governor of New Orleans. Sherman had been serving as military governor of Memphis for 5 months. And in December of 1862, Sherman wrote to his brother, expressing his concern over Butler's treatment of civilians in New Orleans. He wrote, "I see much complaint against Butler at New Orleans. I have had a similar task in Memphis and succeeded in allaying all opposition without lowering the dignity or pretensions of our national government. I believe I could do the same in Louisiana." And he said if the question of removing Butler arose, he urged his brother to put forward his name as a suitable replacement. Now, one might think it's somewhat ironic, given his later notoriety, that Sherman would consider himself better able to handle a hostile population. But this kind of fit in with what I had discovered about Sherman in my previous work. And this is my book. Now, okay. I just want to talk a little bit about the genesis of the project because I was never trained in Civil War history. I was trained in women's history. And my original dissertation project was going to be a study of refugees in the South during the war, predominantly women, of course. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to juxtapose that, what I saw as chaotic movement of refugees, with a linear movement. And the only military campaign I knew about was Sherman's March. And I thought, well, that's linear, right? And so there was no Civil War historian at Duke. I had never actually had a class in Civil War history. I didn't tell everybody that in my job talk, but I've never actually had a class in women's history. I had to teach myself. And so, as this novice, and of course under the influence of Margaret Mitchell, I looked at Georgia. And the first thing I did was read the official report in the wake of the march across Georgia. And the official report basically said nothing of great importance occurred, which I thought was really strange. So then I started looking at soldiers' letters and diaries. And soldiers across the board talk about the campaign across Georgia in festive terms. They had a great deal of fun. They talk about it in terms of picnic and the frolic of campaigning, which wasn't really surprising because the weather was great, there was lots of food, and nobody was shooting at them. And in fact, what I discovered is that Georgia suffered far more humiliation than material damage. This picture of, those of you who have seen Gone with the Wind, the swath of fire across Georgia, just didn't actually happen. There was very little destruction, physical destruction happened in Georgia. It was a different case in South Carolina. And so the only other major destruction that I'd ever heard about was Columbia. So I started to look into Columbia, South Carolina. And when I looked at the evidence of people who were writing about it either right at the time or within a year of the destruction, I found a very, very different story. And so what I found was a lot of people in Columbia, they talked about the Yankees as a group, as terrible people, but we had a kind guard, and this one was really nice, and this one cried, and I thought, this is very strange. And so I quickly realized that there was a much more complex story to be told. And so the book, as it evolved, became a study of the interaction between Union soldiers and Southern civilians, black and white. And I made some interesting discoveries, and I'm just going to mention 3 of them to give you kind of an idea of what I had to work with. In February of 1865, a Confederate soldier in the trenches learned that Sherman's soldiers were an imminent threat to his family, who lived in South Carolina. And he wrote to his wife. He warned them that it was more than likely that they would lose all their material possessions, but he did not express any concern whatsoever over their physical safety. In fact, he advised his family that, and this is quote, "Should any scoundrel intrude or go rummaging around the place, don't hesitate to shoot." Now, this is not actually an image of a quaking Southern belle. 10 days later, he heard his family had survived, and he thanked God for such brave mothers and sisters, and basically renewed his own commitment to the cause. At the same time, in Columbia, I found a Union officer who looked at the charred remains of the city and openly wept at the distress of homeless women and children. And I found an ex-slave who had decided to remain on her South Carolina plantation rather than flee with the Union Army, also remembering that month with a great deal of bitterness, because she wrote all she had to thank the Yankees for was a hungry belly and freedom. Now, those 3 commentaries offered a very different view of the nature of Sherman's campaign from traditional accounts of a military strategy that destroyed war resources and the morale. And so by integrating this evidence from the Union soldiers with civilians, black and white, it becomes a much, much more complex story. And one that I think illuminates the importance of culture for determining the limits of war and how it is fought. And so I begin with the premise that war is culturally sanctioned violence. And if we think of war as culturally sanctioned violence, I think you can put a military campaign into a much broader social context and look at an array of behavioral patterns that include racial attitudes and gender ideology, and even perceptions of how men fight. There's a strong cultural component. For today, I'm going to concentrate on the interaction between soldiers, Union soldiers, and Confederate women, both in South Carolina and Louisiana. So, well, actually, just as an aside, the original title of this book was Terrible Has Been the Storm, The Cultural Politics of Invasion, which I thought was a really great title. And the press said, I can't use that title. The press, when you write a book in Civil War history, the press get very excited because they think they're actually going to make some money. So they're hoping for a general readership audience. And they said, if you call it The Cultural Politics of Invasion, the buyers at Barnes & Noble aren't going to understand what that means. So it's now called When Sherman Marched North from the Sea, Resistance on the Confederate Home Front, which I thought was a little boring, but nevertheless. But that's the way I thought about it, the cultural politics of invasion. So part of my argument there is that this invasion was both geographical and psychological. Because when the Union Army went in, they had constructed this vision of the southern landscape as a military terrain. When they actually invaded and began what they saw as a punishment of South Carolina, it became an invasion of homes. And these homes were populated, for the most part, by women and by children. And Union soldiers, contrary to popular images in the South, were not universal brutes. I have a hard time selling that in the South, but they weren't universal brutes. They were actually men who struggled with a series of conflicting emotions, and many of them expressed a great deal of concern about invading female domestic space. The women that they confronted, on the other hand, frequently found their fear turning to anger because they saw these men coming in, destroying their homes and belongings. And Union soldiers write all the time about how surprised they are at the intensity with which many of these Confederate women stand up to them. For example, a Union cavalry officer invaded a woman's home in Barnwell, South Carolina, and this woman wrote that she determined to remain as firm as possible. And she went up to the soldier and she told him that she expected civil and polite treatment from a gentleman. My strength, she said, had been given to me by almighty power and could not be taken from me by a Yankee's venomous tongue. Now, women, for the most part, used venomous tongues as their primary weapon against the Yankee invaders. And this resulted in a variety of responses, sometimes reluctant admiration, sometimes moral castigation. A New Jersey officer remarked on how determined and resolute he found the white women of the South, and another said that the so-called tender sex was the match of the roughest and most brutal soldier when it came to the use of obscene words. These women were branded she-devils, and some soldiers actually blamed Southern women for keeping up the war and said that they seemed to display a vindictiveness and a zeal for blood that seemed unprecedented. There's some more amusing comments. For example, in Columbia, I found this soldier who commented that South Carolina women were much nicer than those in Alabama and Georgia because they didn't use as much tobacco. Now, when women stand up to these soldiers, when they manifest female power, Union soldiers are somewhat perturbed. These are men, for the most part, they're veteran soldiers. They're not the later substitutes or convicts or kind of the dregs, These are men who have come, for the most part, from good homes, who have a good set of moral values, and they bring these domestic values into the war. Values that are based on the idea that home is a haven. And so, on the one hand, they're ready to express sympathy for women who are crying, who have tears rolling down their cheeks. But when Southern women kind of vent their feelings and they use curse words, sometimes it's difficult for them to overlook what they say is what the women have done to keep up the war. And so sometimes we get this moral judgment. Some Southern women may be unworthy of protection. They're not ladies. But I think this is based on a misinterpretation of what is considered appropriate female behavior in the South. Now, both the North and the South, of course, place a great deal of importance on a woman's display of outward submission to male authority. But my argument would be that in the South, this is not based on a belief that women are inherently delicate creatures. It's more based on the idea that they're choosing to restrain an inner strength for the benefit of social harmony. It's very much that steel magnolias idea. On the outside, they're very ladylike and beautiful. On the inside, they're tough women. And on the basis of this understanding, in the period before the war, women are frequently left to manage plantations and farms alone. So when they're threatened with an invading army, they see themselves as responsible for the survival of the family, while still remaining in a traditionally accepted framework. And so these conflicting interpretations of appropriate gender behavior cause soldiers deep misgivings about their actions, but they also allow Southern women to defend themselves without fear of bodily harm. They expect to be treated as ladies. Now, if this is the case, that the Confederacy was full of strong, feisty white women who stood up to Union soldiers, what did historical memory do to them? Well, for the most part, this strength, this determination has been obscured. It's been funneled into this image of women as victims, which largely depoliticizes them as political actors in their own right, as actively struggling for nation. Instead, we have icons that have to be protected by men. And of course, this serves a multitude of purposes in the post-war years. It renders Yankee actions and Sherman's strategy as particularly egregious acts of war, rather than heroic discharges of duty on the battlefield. And in comparison, Southern military efforts become symbols of courage and fortitude, especially when they're outnumbered and outgunned. So a demonization of Sherman, combined with a Southern quest for moral victory, tends to obscure women's roles as shapers of Confederate nationalism in their own rights. So the memory of the war and the influence of popular culture has made Sherman the personification of all Yankee atrocities. And although it has been kinder to Butler, in 1862, Butler had earned the nickname of the Beast and was considered one of the most hated men in the South. So it seemed to me that this was a nice transition for my next project, because I seem to be attracted to historical villains, not least two who have been renowned for their alleged atrocities against women. And as I often tell my students, my opinion is history is a creative art. And like artists, we're drawn to certain topics by some unidentifiable sense. And this was kind of brought home to me a couple of months later, after I decided I was going to do this project on Butler. I was on a plane sitting next to a man who lived in kind of central, rural part of Florida. And we got chatting, and I told him I was a Civil War historian, and he got very excited about that. And he said to me, well, he said, I haven't even thought about the Civil War since I was in high school. And this would be a man probably, say around 60. Never thought about Civil War since I was in high school, but one thing I know is that Sherman and all his progeny should have been summarily executed for the rape and pillage of the South. So I said, well, I said, there has been some evidence unearthed that it wasn't quite as bad as that. And he was quiet for a moment, and he said, well, thank you for clearing that up. Do you know that Butler treated all the women in New Orleans like they were prostitutes? So I kind of gave up at that point. I figured, I said, well, maybe I'll look into that. So I kind of thought that was like serendipity, and I was on the right track. So let's move now to occupied New Orleans and the Beast, and take a closer look at this woman order. So let me give you a little bit of background on Butler. Butler's determination to be in control had first been evidenced in Baltimore, Maryland. Right at the beginning of the war, May of 1861, it was an easy coup for an extremely inexperienced soldier. Maryland had been relatively submissive, but Confederate women in Maryland also gave Butler a taste of female defiance. They walked around the streets sporting Confederate flags on their chests, and they did this, sweeping aside of their cloaks to avoid contamination by Union soldiers. Now, for the most part, Union troops took this quite lightly, and their favorite response was to flash small Confederate flags that they had sewn on the seat of their pants. So it was kind of taken as a joke. But when Butler got to New Orleans, he was more than ready to deal with this particular foe. So he entered New Orleans on May the 1st of 1862 and marched with a great deal of pomp and circumstances through a sea of people who were really humiliated at the fall of their city. A lot of feelings of hatred, resentment. Butler had no regard for the sensibilities of Confederate sympathizers. He wasn't interested in conciliating them. He wanted to demonstrate immediately that he intended to rule New Orleans with an iron hand. Now, if we look a little more into Butler's background, it's kind of interesting because he actually grew up with a host of strong female role models for whom he had a great deal of respect. And in his memoirs, he talks about his grandmother. He had a great deal of love and respect for his grandmother, and he talked about how he sat at her knee and she told him stories about wrongs done to women by men. His mother brought Butler and his brother up single-handed. His father had died when he was very young, and she was a matron at Lowell Mills, one of the boarding houses. So she was a strong, independent, single parent. And his wife, Sarah Butler, who until her marriage had been a renowned actress. Now, you can't get more public than an actress in the mid-19th century. And Butler absolutely adored his wife, and he insisted that she accompany him on many of his campaigns. She was his closest confidant, she was his closest companion, and she was there with him in at the fall of New Orleans. So he had all these strong women in his life. She wrote home to her family as soon as she got to New Orleans that she suspected her husband was spoiling for a showdown. This is what she wrote. Mr. Butler would rejoice at some demonstration from a mob that he might sweep the streets and make these people feel that there is a power here to sustain or crush them. This city will be governed and made to wear the outward forms of decency, however much they struggle against it. So Butler and his wife take occupation of the finest residence in the city, and there he establishes his headquarters. According to one observer, there he sat in imperial dignity in his judgment seat. Now, Butler's office was set up to both intimidate and humiliate those who visited. He conspicuously placed a pistol right in the middle of his desk. And to frustrate people who might try to kind of move their chair up to whisper in his ear, he actually tied a leg of the chair to the desk so you couldn't actually move it. And if these people, these petitioners, were to look up, above his head he had a placard. The placard read, "There is no difference between a he and a she adder in their venom." So it's a clear indication of the way Butler felt. Now, the she-adders, as they came to be called, of New Orleans, very quickly made clear their dislike of Yankee soldiers. Butler was inundated with reports of Confederate women spitting in soldiers' faces, making insulting gestures, taking great pains to hold their skirts aside. It's like they fear contamination if they touch Union soldiers. One woman who fell refused the assistance that was offered by two Union officers, claiming she'd rather lie in the gutter. They would get off streetcars whenever a soldier got on board. In fact, they showed every possible sign of disgustance and aversion. Now, Butler did try to inject some humor into the situation. On one occasion, as he was going along the street, he saw 5 or 6 women looking down from the balcony. And as he passed, he said, with something between a shriek and a sneer, they all whirled around, and with a flirt which threw out their skirts in a regular circle like the pirouette of a dancer. So you imagine this crinoline, and they're all turning around, and their skirts are going up. And Butler wrote, those women evidently know which end of them looks the best. So, according to Butler, that remark closed the exhibition. However, the pièce de résistance was a much less amusing balcony incident when a group of women emptied the contents of a chamber pot on an officer's head. Butler was in somewhat of a quandary. He was especially uneasy about the youth and the beauty of many of the culprits. He was concerned that his soldiers would be unable to contain themselves in the face of this kind of contempt and humiliation, especially at the hands of attractive young women. And he wrote about officers who expressed a fundamental respect for women coming to him, and he said their cheeks were crimson with shame in the effort to repress their indignation. And they begged him to do something to suppress the evil, as they called it. And so Butler had to come up with a plan. He believed that many of these insolent and rebellious young women would actually welcome the opportunity to become patriotic martyrs. So he didn't want to arrest them. He said a city could hardly be considered to be under good government if he could not control what he called the epidemic amongst women. And so it demanded an ingenious solution. That ingenious solution was the General Order number 28, which came to be called the Woman Order. And I'm just going to read it to you, it's very short. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subjected to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. Now, under New Orleans law, a woman of the town was subjected to a $5 fine and a night in the calaboose. This was seen as a misdemeanor. It was not a political act of resistance. And so by diminishing what these women were doing, Butler was demeaning the perpetrators of those so-called crimes. Now, local officials, members of his personal staff, expressed some concern about this order. They thought it might be misconstrued as a license to assault Confederate women. Butler did not agree with that interpretation. He said the greatest strength of this order was that it would execute itself. And what he meant by that was it would encourage women and Union soldiers to regulate their own behavior. So instead of creating martyrs by arresting the women and possibly triggering insurrections, this order rendered women insignificant. Pray, how do you treat a common woman, he asked. You pass her by unheeded. And then he said, as gentlemen, you can and will take no notice of her. So it indicates Butler had a very clear understanding of gender roles, accepted gender behavior. Now, of course, the Confederacy was unconvinced with this explanation. Confederate General Beauregard, who was beloved son of New Orleans, used the order as a rallying cry for his troops to defend Southern womanhood against what he called the rough and lean soldiers of the North. Apparently, according to Beauregard, these soldiers had been given permission to treat the ladies of the South as common harlots. And even across the Atlantic, British Prime Minister Palmerston said that history offered no example of so infamous an act as to deliberately hand over the female inhabitants of a conquered city to the unbridled license of an unrestrained soldiery. Now, the wording of the Woman Order and its undeniable sexual innuendo is certainly up for interpretation. But as the discussions reverberated in the diplomatic world, not only in America, but in Europe, gender issues, gender ideology was at the heart of larger political and military discussions. And timing was very important. because this was a point when European recognition of an independent confederacy was a very real possibility. And so the military governor's day-to-day administrative policies took on a much greater significance than just controlling city streets. New Orleans had very close commercial ties to Great Britain. It had strong cultural ties to France and a host of other European countries. A number of European consuls lived in the city. Now, Butler was deeply suspicious of these diplomats. He was convinced that the consuls were all, as he wrote, bound up with the rebels by marriage, commercial, and social relations. And despite their claims of neutrality, Butler believed most consular offices were what he called asylums for fostering rebellion. And he had no hesitation in passing a variety of very restrictive orders against the consuls, which infuriated diplomats and alienated their government. Butler wrote that in general he received no direction from the federal authorities for long periods of time. Yet, he wrote, whenever I did anything that caused a little whippersnapper emissary from some government in Europe to complain, the Secretary of State responded immediately. Otherwise, he said, I was supreme. Now, interestingly enough, it's only in the wake of extended diplomatic correspondence concerning Butler's high-handed treatment of diplomatic standing and demands that foreign nationals take an oath of allegiance to the United States that the Woman Order comes under close scrutiny in Europe. It doesn't come up at the time when it's passed, but it's several months later. The British minister to Washington sent a copy to his government without commentary at the end of May, just after it was issued. And it might have rested there if Butler had not proceeded to display behavior which was determined offensive and alarming towards the British, French, and Dutch consuls. So much so that the British decided that they were going to send a man of war to the port of New Orleans. They send this man of war called the Rinaldo. And when the Rinaldo arrives, it brings these problems, Butler's pressing challenges together, in a way that really exasperate him beyond endurance. The Southern press are delighted because British soldiers, British sailors on the vessel burst out and sang some of our patriotic songs. So the British vessel comes in and they all start singing Confederate songs. The New York Times, of course, is less enthusiastic. They compare the officers of the ship to pirates who were intent on insulting the Union by their behavior, especially their playing of the Bonnie Blue Flag, which is kind of a very popular Confederate song. Moreover, the captain of the ship starts inviting select Confederate women who are known for their secessionist sympathies on board the vessel for nightly parties. One New Orleans woman described such a party that was held for the benefit of secession women. Many a lady opened her vial of wrath, she wrote, for all were told that freedom of speech should be the order of the night. And the Northern press confirmed the fact that at these gatherings, the United States, President Lincoln, and General Butler all come in for all sorts of vulgar abuse. Now, the parties attract large crowds on the levees. They gather to hear all these secessionist songs being played by floating bands, and they respond with cheers for the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis. Now, the following week, a further dispatch reached the British government, detailing the Union's response to concerns that had just recently been raised over the Woman Order. The Secretary of State, William Seward, had listened very patiently to the British ambassador. He brought up concerns about the Woman Order, and Seward answered in a way that could only be understood as a very subtle insult to British manhood. Such were the sensibilities of the American nation in regard to the female sex, explained Secretary of State Seward, that none had looked upon General Butler's order as conveying the meaning that has been attached to it in Europe. Otherwise, it would have been at once disavowed. After all, added Seward, didn't the British Crown display the motto, honi soit qui mal y pense, which means evil to him who evil thinks. So there's something wrong with the British understanding. They're clearly in a mindset to misinterpret. So the large point here is that the general's treatment of Confederate women had become the subject of a heated debate. However, the debate was amongst men, and it cast women as the victims, or at least the potential victims, of sexual violation. And of course, that requires male action. If, however, we look at the Woman Order from the perspective of the women towards whom it was intended, there's a very different narrative. The women who wrote about their experiences under Yankee occupation were predominantly from the upper class, and I have not found one within Butler's reach who expressed any fear whatsoever of sexual vulnerability. Surprisingly, many of them don't even mention it. And when they do write about it, they describe it as an act designed to humiliate rather than terrorize. Humiliate because it blurs very distinct class lines. Elite women make very clear their disdain of unseemly female behavior as conduct unworthy of their own position in society. So, for example, a young woman in the city wrote that she felt unspeakable contempt for long-tongued, slandering women who could spit in a gentleman's face merely because he wore a blue uniform. Loud women, she wrote, what contempt I have for you. Now, of course, it may well be that having been called upon to be accountable for their behavior, elite women sought to retain their dignity by distancing themselves from the order, an order designed to humiliate them. They were, however, keenly aware of the larger political implications. For example, the wife of a Confederate colonel made only a passing reference to the order when it was passed. 2 months later, however, she heard that the British Prime Minister had publicly protested, and she reconsidered. And she wrote, in her opinion, the Woman Order might be beneficial to the Confederate war effort because Prime Minister Palmerston's portrait of Butler as the vilest of oppressors might actually encourage foreign intervention. 3 months later, Butler passes another order that really does elicit vehement responses from these women. General Order 76 is issued because by early September, Butler had noted that many businessmen were transferring their assets to women to avoid the consequences of a confiscation act. And this General Order number 76 was designed to stop these practices. It demanded that women, as well as men, must publicly take an oath of allegiance to the United States. If they didn't do that, they would have to declare themselves as enemies of the government and thus be subject to the confiscation of all their properties and possible expulsion from the city. Now, an order had been passed earlier requiring those who didn't take the oath to register as an enemy, but it hadn't specified women as well as men. One Confederate woman wrote that this order made her brain burn with indignation. But she said Butler had read the situation correctly. And that too, and this is a quote, to avoid the pains and penalties of confiscation, many have sought to cover up their property under the broad folds of feminine crinoline. But being required to take the oath, she wrote, was the most detestable of Butler's act and surpassed what she called the unmeaning twaddle about General Order 28. So you get this really different narrative from the women's side. There's a deadline to take this oath. And Anne Penrose, who was the wife of a Confederate colonel, had put it off to the very last minute. She kept hoping that the city would be delivered by nearby Confederate troops. And she couldn't bring herself to publicly disavow her country because she felt like if she did, then her son might feel it was a reproach on him. He was fighting for her. And that how would he feel if his mother was now to swear an oath of allegiance to the enemy? But when she considered the very severe penalties of General Order 76, she saw no alternative. She wrote if she had been younger or stronger, she would have faced expulsion. But now she believed her son would understand that, she wrote, "The sin lay upon those who forced it upon me." And shortly after this last rite of public dishonor, an observer in the city wrote that although the women clearly regarded the Yankees with loathing, they did seem outwardly subdued. He wrote, "The middle and upper classes of New Orleans seem alternatively ashamed and amazed at the cool manner in which, step by step, Butler has disarmed them and placed them at his mercy." So Confederate women who found themselves forced to comply with Butler's order respond with their most powerful weapon, their tongues. And the general becomes subject to a host of lampoons, parodies, which Butler simply ignores. But one of the last letters he received did elicit a response. This letter was signed by one of your she-adders, and she damned him for eternity. She wrote, "When you came here, it was in your power to make friends instead of enemies by making your course with gentlemanly conduct. But instead of treating the citizens of New Orleans with the respect and consideration which a civilized and refined people were entitled to, you have heaped every indignity upon us that your brutal nature was capable of conveying." Now, Butler had no qualms about including this correspondence in his letter book. But in typically egotistical style, he claimed the last word. And on the back of the letter, he scribbled in pencil, "Ridiculous attempt of a she-adder to wound with her poisonous venom the greatest snake tamer now alive." Now, it's interesting because Butler actually publishes this letter in his letter book. He publishes a lot of derogatory material about him. But the letter, the original letter in the Library of Congress, has this penciled across the back, which is kind of a cool find. So let me try and tie this up. Butler, the women of occupied New Orleans, really enter into this dialogue of ridicule and contempt. And class and gender are central issues. But Butler is really a master of manipulation, and he plays these women at their own game by coercing them into controlling their own behavior. It's a masterful move by a man who recognized deeply rooted class and gender identities at play in the mid-19th century. But as Butler's critics argued about the construction of womanhood and implicitly Victorian manhood, like the women that I talked about in Sherman's March, they cast Confederate women as these potential victims of sexual violation, whose predicament requires male action. Almost every Southern paper prints this report, an appeal purportedly written by what's called the Daughters of the New Orleans, begging their men to save them. "For the sake of your sisters," they allegedly implore, "do not leave your women to the mercy of a merciless foe." But while men were rendering Confederate women unassertive victims of Yankee violence, the women told a very different story. They expressed few concerns about sexual vulnerability. They didn't protest General Order 28 as much as they distanced themselves from it, in an attempt to reassert what power they could by virtue of their class, if not their gender. But they did devote considerably more time to the humiliation of being forced into a public denunciation of their country. And they focused on the larger political and war-related issues. But despite outward compliance, they did harbor deep, abiding hatred of Butler. So one of the fascinating things about all this is, of course, what I would call the cultural politics of memory. Butler has been remembered with contempt, Sherman with horror. Southern popular memory of the Civil War and the quest for moral victory turned Sherman into a villain. Butler became the subject of derision. There are no ghost tours in Columbia that feature a spectral Sherman. But to this day, Butler is a key player in a similar tourist attraction in New Orleans. You can go on a ghost tour, they have a spectral Butler. And it seems that Southern women have certainly been a major force in creating the symbolic memories of both these men. So let me leave you with the words of a poet, Stephen Vincent Benet. In 1928, Stephen Vincent Benet wrote an epic poem of the Civil War. It's in the style of Beowulf or the Iliad. It's 300 plus pages. And it chronicles the years from 1859 to the end of the war. And Benet does deal at some length with both these men, although in 1928, Benet believed Butler's villainy outshone Sherman's. But Benet has a warning. Make war on the men, he cautioned. The ladies have too long memories.